There's a new paper titled The Leaderboard Illusion, and it has taken the LLM community by a storm. Even people like Andre Karpathy are commenting on this paper. Now, in the paper, the authors tried to highlight systematic issues that we have with benchmarks, and more specifically with the LM Arena. Now, we probably all know that the benchmarks at this point are saturated. However, the allegations here are a lot more serious, and they really show some of the issues that people have been highlighting, specifically with benchmarks like LM Arena. So in this video, we are going to look at what these issues are, what the community is saying about it, and also what the LM Arena team has to say. But I do want to highlight that the issues that we're going to be discussing are not only limited to LM Arena. It's more of a systematic issue. Now, in order to understand what exactly they're describing in the paper, I think it's first better to understand what exactly is LM Arena. So this was a leaderboard that was created back in May 2023. So it's almost 2 years old at this point. And it's a benchmark platform for large language models that features anonymous randomized battles in a crowd-sourced manner. The idea was to put two LLMs against each other and present the responses to the user for the exact same prompt in a blind fashion. And it has kind of become industry standard. In fact, during the recent Google Next keynote, CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, highlighted multiple times that Gemini 2.5 Flash is the top-rated model on Chatbot Arena leaderboard. In hindsight, that was not a good thing to do. No, there has been some criticism of LM Arena in the past. However, the turning point was the release of LAMA 4. With the LAMA 4 release, in the official blog post, the LAMA team said LAMA 4 Maverick offers a best-in-class performance to cost ratio with an experimental chat version scoring ELO of 1417 on LM Arena. Now pay close attention to chat version that is experimental. It's going to become very important when we look at that paper. But if you look at the current score of LAMA 4 Maverick, it is on the 38th rank compared to the second rank when this was released. And now instead of that 1400 score, it's only scoring about 1200. So what exactly happened there? And that's why we need to look at this paper, the Leaderboard Illusion. Now, before that, I do want to point out that some of the authors belong to Cohere Labs, which is another foundation model company. So take everything with a grain of salt and draw your own conclusions. Okay, so in the abstract, they say Chatbot Arena has emerged as the go-to leaderboard for ranking the most capable AI systems, but they found that there are systematic issues that have resulted in distorted playing field. Now, what exactly are those systematic issues? They say they found undisclosed private testing practices that benefits a handful of providers who are able to test multiple variants before public release and can actually retract scores if desired. In fact, they were able to test 27 different private models or variants, and they were able to pick the one that was doing the best and report those ELO scores. Now in the paper, they say that they were able to establish the ability of these providers to choose the best score lead to biased arena scores due to selective disclosure of performance results. This experimental chat version was actually one of those 27 variants, which did great, but the actual model that was released is pretty bad on LM Arena. These proprietary model providers are able to gain access to the data that helps them build better models on this specific leaderboard. Essentially, they are just overfitting to this one leaderboard. And this is actually something that the LM Arena team acknowledges themselves. So they say, we also share 20% of the data back with the model providers to help them improve their model from our community's perspective. Now, nobody thought that the model providers are taking this data back, updating their model or aligning it, and then testing another version of the same model. But that's exactly what seems to be happening. And as a result, we're going to see models that do really well on LM Arena, but their real world usage is extremely limited. Okay, so this plot really captures all the main issues. The first one is data access disparity. Proprietary providers benefit the most from free open community data, right? And they can basically use that as a feedback mechanism to fine-tune, overfit their models to Chatbot Arena leaderboard. So as a result, they actually say that even small amounts of data can lead to 112% gain in performance improvement on this specific arena. That's basically going back to data sharing, because they are not only sharing the user inputs, but also preference data with the API providers. And as a result, the model providers are able to handpick models that are doing well specifically on the LM Arena board and just report those. And another big issue is model removal. So 66% of silently removed models are open weight models or open source models, but they're not removing the proprietary models at the similar scale. Now, I do want to point out that LM Arena is not the only benchmark that has come under criticism. So if you recall, there was this famous frontier math benchmark, which is supposed to be one of the hardest benchmark when it comes to mathematics. A preview version of O3 was the first model that scored 25% on that specific benchmark. The previous best model was scoring only 2%. So this was a crazy, huge improvement. But then it turns out that OpenAI completely funded this specific benchmark and its creation. And the researchers shared with them exclusive access to the most hardest problems with solutions. Now, there might be a case in which they did not use the solutions, but having like uninterrupted exclusive access does raise a lot of questions. Then there was this case of Arc AGI leaderboard, where the same O3 preview scored about 75 or 80%, which was unheard of at that point. However, it turns out that they also used some of the training data, which they were not supposed to. So in general, I would say there are two categories of benchmarks. One are these academic benchmarks, such as GPQA and so on and so forth. So in my opinion, these are already saturated. These model creators are probably indirectly using data from these benchmarks, and hence we're going to see higher and higher scores. And the second category of benchmarks are something like Frontier Math or LM Arena. But in those cases, you really need to look at who are behind those benchmarks and who are sponsoring them. And as pointed out by this paper, in some of these benchmarks, these proprietary API providers have a lot of advantage and have probably a lot more access than what they should have. Another thing to keep in mind is what exactly a benchmark is measuring. So if you look at the LM Arena, the language one, which measure human preferences, then you shouldn't be using rating on something like this for a coding model. In fact, this was highlighted by Alex Albert, who is the head of cloud relations. Now, this post was before the release of the paper, so it's not related specifically to the paper itself. But he says much of the AI industry is caught in a particularly toxic feedback loop right now. Blindly chasing better human preference scores is to the LLMs what chasing total watch time is to the social media algorithms. It's a recipe for manipulating users instead of providing genuine value. There is a reason you don't find Claude at number 1 on ChatSlop leaderboards. I hope the rest of the industry realizes this before users pay the price. Now, if you have been following, something similar is happening with OpenAI. So they made GPT-4o really bad. And here's a tweet from Sam Altman. the last couple of GPT-4o updates have made the personality too psychopathy and annoying, even though there are some really good parts of it, and we are working on fixes as soon as possible, some today and some this week. At some point, we will share our learnings from this. It's been interesting. They actually had to roll back all of the updates because it was getting really bad. And if you try to optimize for the wrong things, the model behavior is going to get pretty terrible pretty soon. Now, coming back to the paper and LM Arena, and I'm going to also show you a response from the LM Arena team themselves, which I think is very important to look at. So here is a post from Arvind, who is a CS professor at Princeton. So he says, devastating takedown of Chatbot Arena. It's one thing for leaderboards to suck because they try to quantify the unquantifiable, but quite another thing to actively choose flagrantly unscientific and non-transparent practices that benefits the big dogs. Now, in a subsequent post, he clarified what exactly he meant by flagrantly unscientific. The main issue pointed out in the paper seems like a version of multiple comparison problem, which is a textbook. Many people, including me, were very surprised to learn how things work behind the scenes. The paper makes many transparency suggestions. And practice benefit the big dogs, also explained in the paper. So actively chose, while many issues with leaderboards are inevitable, virtually everything reported in the paper seems to be the result of choice that could have been made differently. Then he says, I realize in the retrospect that my wording could have been misconstrued to mean the Chatbot Arena is colluding with some companies. I certainly did not mean to imply that and apologize for not thinking of this potential misinterpretation. And I also want to make sure to mention that I don't think there was something nefarious happening, but the problem is how the LM Arena is set up and what type of access these companies were having to the data. Now, Andrei Karpathy also shared his thoughts, and this aligns very well with some of the things that we have been hearing from the community. He says, I first became a bit suspicious when at one point a while back, a Gemini model scored number 1, way above the second best. But when I tried to switch for a few days, it was worse than what I was used to. And there was a time when Gemini was scoring really high on LM Arena, and people thought it was pretty bad. And this was probably like Gemini 1 or 1.5. Now, another example is that he pointed out that Claude 3.5 was a top tier model in his personal use, but it ranked really low on Arena. And the Claude models have never done well on LM Arena because they are very specialized for coding. Now, here's another very interesting one. That there were a number of other relatively random models, often suspiciously small, with little to no real-world knowledge, as far as I know, yet they ranked quite high too. And again, when it comes to human preferences, you can actually game the system very easily. One way of doing that would be just produce a lot of text, produce a lot of lists, bullet points, and emojis. And people tend to like those responses. Andrei Karpathy pointed out the open router rankings could potentially be a good alternative and could become top tier. But I think if you look at some of the data that is coming in, the ranking is based on the number of tokens that are being generated or consumed. I think apart from the performance, the cost, latency, and the number of tokens generated by the model in response to a question are going to be the most critical parameter, which will really skew the results if the ranking is based on just the number of tokens. You can actually kind of see that trend. For example, Gemini 2.0 Flash, GPT-4o Mini, these are relatively smaller models, but they're going to be less expensive. Even V3, DeepSeek V3 is relatively inexpensive, and not for every application you need the best model. So Andrei Karpathy also pointed that out here as well. So he says, Open Router allows people, companies to quickly switch APIs between LLM providers. All of them have real use cases, not toy problems or puzzles. They have their own private evals, and all of them have an incentive to get their choices right. So by choosing one LLM over another, they are directly voting for some combos of capabilities and cost, right? Which makes sense. But then he pointed out that I don't think OpenRouter is there just yet in both quantity and diversity of use, but something of its kind, I think, has great potential to grow into a very nice, very difficult to game evolve. And I tend to agree with him. In fact, when it comes to benchmarks, it's always good to have your own internal benchmarks. And if a new model comes in, just test it on those internal benchmarks. Now, to finish this video, I do want to highlight the response from the LM Arena team. It's very important to recognize that they have done a really amazing job at not only creating this benchmark, but also maintaining it. And it has been pretty effective, and hopefully they will be able to address some of the concerns that are being highlighted both in this paper as well as from the broader community. In here, they say the leaderboard reflects millions of fresh, real human preferences. One might disagree with human preferences. They are subjective, but that's exactly why they matter. And it's very important to understand that the benchmark is just measuring human preferences. It's not looking at any other capabilities. Then they talk about that they are working on statistical methods like style and sentiment control to decompose human preferences into its constituents part. I personally think it's going to be extremely hard to do, but it would be interesting to see what exactly they come up with. And they say that if pre-release testing and data helps models optimize for millions of people's preferences, that's a good thing. Now, this is where I think people will disagree. Testing pre-release models is absolutely fine. And again, it's really good for the community. I totally agree. However, having that data provided to the model providers or API providers, and then they tuning the model specifically for this one benchmark is probably the bad thing, and we don't want that. So pre-release model testing is also a huge part of why people come to LM Arena. That is in fact true. Now they say every model provider makes different choices about how to use and value human preferences, and it seems like companies like Meta are just trying to optimize for this one specific benchmark by testing 27 different variants. And then they pointed out they help Meta with pre-release testing of LAMA 4, like they have helped many other model providers in the past. We support open source development. The whole platform analysis tools are open source, and they also release millions of open conversations as well. Then they go on to try to address some of the issues raised in the write-up. So they say, unfortunately, there are a number of factual errors and misleading statements in the write-up. They specifically are disagreeing with figure 7 and 8. So figure 7 and 8 are simulated results. Figure 7 is showing the impact of number of private variants tested on the best expected arena score. And 8 is simulated impact of best of n submission strategies on LM Arena leaderboard ranking. Now, I'm not going to comment on this because I don't really have access to the data, but the other two are very interesting. They say, we design our policy to prevent model providers from just reporting the highest score they received during testing. We only publish the score for the model they release publicly. Now, this is a recent update because with LAMA 4, exactly the same thing happened, that LAMA 4 reported the highest score, and even the LM Arena team reported that highest score. But when it came out that they had an experimental chat version specifically fine-tuned on LM Arena, then both LM Arena and LAMA team had to retract that. They say many of the numbers in the paper do not reflect reality. See the blog post below, released a few days ago, for actual statistics on the number of models tested from different providers. So here's the blog post that they are pointing towards. Now, if you look here, they say 400 plus models have been evaluated across various modalities. 300 plus evaluation have been pre-release. So majority of those were pre-release models. And if you look at the distribution here, Most of them are actually proprietary models. So Google, Meta is open weight. However, they are probably testing a lot of different variations. And then Alibaba, OpenAI, Mistral are bigger contributors. Now, even on the sampling pairs, I think if they're not exactly the same, they align very well with the numbers in the report or the paper that the team of researchers put together. Anyways, I hope this is going to be a wake-up call both to the leaderboard creators and the model providers as well. Anyways, I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, and as always, see you in the next one.